The fluorescent lights in the executive hallway flickered as Margaret Chen pushed her cleaning cart past the rows of mahogany doors. Her hands, weathered and strong despite her 62 years, trembled slightly as she checked her watch. 45 minutes late. Again. She'd worked at Westfield Industries for 17 years, never missing a day until 3 months ago. Now lateness had become her unwelcome companion. She paused outside the CEO's office, seeing her reflection in the polished brass nameplate, Thomas Westfield. The man who'd inherited this company from his father, the man who'd never once looked her in the eye. Margaret took a deep breath, knowing what was coming. She'd seen the warning emails, felt the cold stares from human resources. Tonight would be different. Tonight everything would change, but not in the way she expected. Sometimes the truth has a way of breaking through the walls we build around our hearts, brick by careful brick. Where are you watching from tonight? Margaret had started working at Westfield Industries when her daughter was just 5 years old. Back then, the building was half its current size, and old Mr. Westfield, Thomas's father, knew every employee by name. He'd stop by during her night shifts, asking about her daughter's school plays, her dreams of becoming a nurse. Those were different times. When he passed away 7 years ago, his son Thomas took over, and the warmth seemed to drain from the building along with the old man's presence. Thomas was efficient, successful, and distant. The company tripled in size under his leadership, but something essential was lost in the expansion. She'd watched Thomas from afar over the years. This man in his tailored suits who walked the halls like a stranger in his own father's house. He was 43 now, unmarried, childless, devoted entirely to profit margins and quarterly reports. Margaret had heard the whispers among the day staff. He arrived at 6 each morning and left near midnight. He ate lunch at his desk. He'd turned down the same woman 3 times when she'd asked him to the company Christmas party. Some called him cold. Margaret just thought he looked lonely, though she'd never say it aloud. Her own life had been full of warmth, despite its struggles. Her daughter Emily had indeed become a nurse, just as she'd dreamed. Margaret's late husband, David, had worked construction until the accident that took him 12 years ago. After that, it was just her and Emily, making their way, supporting each other. Emily had married a good man, a teacher named Robert, and they'd given Margaret the greatest gift of her life 3 years ago, a grandson named David, after his grandfather. Little David was everything. His laugh could light up a room. His tiny hands reaching for her when she visited on Sundays made every ache in her aging body worthwhile. Emily and Robert were wonderful parents, building the kind of life Margaret had always hoped for her daughter. She'd been so proud, so content, watching her grandson grow, teaching him the old lullabies she'd once sung to Emily. Then, 3 months ago, everything shifted. Emily called her on a Tuesday morning, her voice strange and hollow. "Mom, can you come over? We need to talk." Margaret had known immediately that something was terribly wrong. When she arrived, Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, Robert beside her, both of their eyes red from crying. The words came out slowly, each one a stone dropping into still water. Stage 4, cancer, pancreatic. The doctors had given Emily 6 months, maybe 8 if she responded well to treatment. The world had tilted on its axis that day. Margaret held her daughter as they both wept, little David playing innocently in the next room with his blocks, unaware that his mother was dying. In the weeks that followed, Margaret rearranged her entire life around one purpose, helping Emily fight and helping Robert care for their son. The treatments were brutal. Emily would spend days in bed, weak and nauseated, trying to smile when David toddled in to show her a drawing or a new toy. Margaret began arriving at those chemotherapy appointments, sitting beside her daughter for hours in sterile hospital rooms, holding her hand through the worst of it. She'd help Robert with David in the evenings, cooking meals for their household, doing laundry, anything to ease their burden. And she'd started arriving late to work, not by choice but by necessity. The hospital was 40 minutes from Westfield Industries, and Emily's appointments ran long, and traffic was unpredictable. And sometimes her daughter would have a bad moment right when Margaret needed to leave, and how could she walk away from that? She tried to explain it to her supervisor, a thin man named Harrison who'd nodded sympathetically, but said nothing could be done about company policy. 3 written warnings for tardiness, then termination. That was the rule. Margaret had received her 3rd warning yesterday. She'd read it in the bathroom during her break, tears mixing with the harsh reality of corporate regulations. She couldn't afford to lose this job. Emily's medical bills were astronomical, even with insurance. Robert's teacher salary stretched thin. Margaret's paycheck, modest as it was, helped cover David's daycare, groceries, the little things that kept a household running when catastrophe struck. But tonight, pushing her cart down that executive hallway, Margaret felt a strange kind of peace settling over her. She'd done her best. She'd chosen her daughter over her job, over her perfect attendance record, over her pride. If Thomas Westfield fired her tonight, then so be it. Some things mattered more than a paycheck. She'd find another way. She always had. The office door opened suddenly, and Thomas stood there in his crisp white shirt, tie loosened, exhaustion etched around his eyes. He looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her perhaps for the first time in 7 years. "Mrs. Chen," he said quietly, "we need to talk." Margaret followed Thomas into his office, her heart beating steadily despite her nervousness. She'd cleaned this room 1,000 times, knew every corner of it, but had never sat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. She remained standing, her hands clasped in front of her, waiting. Thomas gestured to a chair, but she shook her head gently. "I'd rather stand, if that's all right, Mr. Westfield." He studied her for a moment, then nodded, moving to stand by the window overlooking the city lights below. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but heavy with unspoken things. "You've been late 14 times in the past 3 months, Thomas said finally, his voice even and professional. "You received 3 written warnings." "You know our policy," Margaret nodded. "I do, sir." She wasn't going to make excuses or beg. Whatever happened now, she'd accept it with dignity. Thomas turned from the window, and she saw something flicker across his face. Frustration maybe, or confusion. "You've worked here for 17 years. Perfect record until recently. I don't understand why you'd throw that away. Why not just show up on time?" The question hung in the air, and Margaret felt a flash of something she rarely allowed herself. Anger. Not at him exactly, but at the unfairness of it all, at the impossible choices life sometimes forced upon you. "Because my daughter is dying," she said quietly, and the words seemed to echo in the spacious office. "And when you're watching your child go through chemotherapy, when you're holding her hair back while she's sick, when your grandson is crying because he doesn't understand why mommy can't play with him anymore, being on time to mop floors doesn't seem quite as important." She hadn't meant to say it like that so bluntly, but there it was. The truth, raw and painful, laid bare between them. Thomas's face went very still. He opened his mouth, closed it, seemed to struggle for words. "I didn't know," he said finally, and his voice had changed somehow, become less certain. "Why didn't you tell anyone? File for family leave?" Margaret smiled sadly. "Family leave is unpaid, Mr. Westfield. I can't afford unpaid. My daughter's medical bills are crushing them. Her husband works hard, but it's not enough. My paycheck helps with their mortgage, with my grandson's needs. If I took leave, they'd lose their house." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I tried to explain to Mr. Harrison in HR, but he said policy was policy." I understood. "I still do. You run a business, not a charity. I just hoped I could manage both, my family and my job, but I couldn't. So I made my choice." Thomas walked to his desk and sat down heavily, as if his legs could no longer support him. He looked different somehow, smaller, more human. "My mother died of cancer," he said suddenly, and Margaret's breath caught. She'd known Thomas's mother had passed, but she'd never known the details. "I was 16. Breast cancer. She fought for 2 years. I remember the hospitals, the smell of them, the way my father would try to keep working, keep everything normal, while she was disappearing a little more each day." His voice had gone rough, memories clearly flooding back. "After she died, my father threw himself into this company. It was all he had left," he said. "He taught me that work was sacred, that building something, maintaining it, was how you honored the people you loved." I thought I understood what he meant. Thomas looked up at Margaret, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "But maybe I got it wrong. Maybe he was just running from his grief, and I learned to run too." Margaret moved then, crossing to the chair she'd refused earlier and sitting down. They weren't boss and employee anymore, not in this moment. They were just two people who'd both lost someone, who both understood the weight of watching someone you love slip away. "Your father was a good man," Margaret said softly. "He asked about my Emily all the time, remembered every detail I told him. Near the end, before he got sick himself, he told me he was proud of the mother I was. I've held on to that. He was good at that," Thomas said, wiping his eyes roughly. "Connecting with people, I'm not. I'm better with numbers, strategies, things that make sense on paper. People are complicated. They have lives outside these walls, problems I don't know how to fix." He looked at Margaret directly. "I should have known. Someone should have told me. Harrison should have brought this to me." "Mr. Harrison followed your rules," Margaret pointed out gently. "You can't blame him for that." Thomas shook his head. "The rules are wrong then. What kind of company punishes someone for being human, for taking care of their family?" He stood up abruptly, pacing now, energy returning to him. "My father built this place on the idea that we take care of our people. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that. I turned it into just another corporation, cold and efficient and heartless." Margaret watched him, seeing something shift in his expression, a door opening that had been closed for years. "If this moment touched your heart, if you're feeling the weight of these two people finally seeing each other, please give this story a thumbs up. Your support means the world." Thomas stopped pacing and looked at Margaret with sudden intensity. "How long does she have?" "Your daughter?" The question was gentle but direct. Margaret's voice wavered as she answered. "The doctor said 6 to 8 months. We're at month 3 now. She's not responding to treatment as well as they'd hoped." The silence that followed was profound. Then Thomas did something Margaret never expected. He pulled out his phone and made a call. "Harrison?" "It's Thomas. I need you to come to my office immediately. I don't care what time it is, now." He hung up and looked at Margaret. "You're not fired, Mrs. Chen, but we're going to change some things around here starting tonight." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, but she barely noticed them. Something was happening, something important, and she didn't quite understand it yet, but she felt it settling around them both like a benediction, like the first warm light after a long, cold night. Harrison arrived 15 minutes later, his tie askew, clearly pulled from his evening at home. He glanced nervously between Thomas and Margaret, who was still seated, her eyes red but her posture dignified. Thomas didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Tell me about our family leave policy," he said, his voice carrying an edge Harrison had never heard before. The HR manager stammered slightly. "Well, we offer up to 12 weeks unpaid leave under FMLA, and employees can use their accrued sick and vacation time. And what about situations like Mrs. Chen's?" Thomas interrupted. "Where an employee needs to care for a dying family member but can't afford unpaid leave." Harrison shifted uncomfortably. "Company policy states that—" Thomas cut him off again, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I didn't ask about current policy. I asked what we do for people in crisis." The question hung heavy in the air. Harrison had no answer because the truth was, they did nothing. They followed the rules, documented the failures, and moved on. Thomas sat back down at his desk and opened his laptop. "Mrs. Chen, what are your current hours?" Margaret cleared her throat, still processing this surreal turn of events. 10 at night until 6 in the morning, Monday through Friday." Thomas nodded, typing rapidly. "And what hours would work better for your family situation?" She blinked, confused. "I don't understand." He looked up at her with an expression that was surprisingly soft. "Emily's treatments, your grandson, helping your son-in-law. When do they need you most?" Margaret felt her heart squeezing. Nobody had asked her that before. Nobody had treated her schedule as something that could be adjusted around her life rather than the other way around. "The appointments are usually in the afternoons," she said slowly. "I help with David, my grandson, in the mornings while Robert teaches. Evenings are when Emily feels worse from the treatment, so I make dinner, help put David to bed." "I could work earlier? Maybe 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon? That way I could—" "Done," Thomas said, still typing. "Your new shift starts Monday. Same pay, same position, but you'll work 6 to 2. That gives you afternoons and evenings for your family." He looked at Harrison. "Make it happen. And I want a full review of every employee's situation on my desk by end of week. If anyone else is struggling silently while we enforce policy blindly, I need to know about it. Harrison nodded, making notes on his phone, though his expression showed he was still trying to process this new version of his boss. But Thomas wasn't finished. He pulled out his personal checkbook, something Margaret had never seen him do. "Medical bills, you said. They're overwhelming?" Margaret felt her pride warring with her desperation. "Mr. Westfield, I wasn't asking for—" He held up a hand gently. "I know you weren't. But my mother's treatment nearly bankrupted us, even with my father's success. I remember my parents arguing late at night about which bills to pay first, which treatments to skip. I was a kid, but I heard everything. No family should have to make those choices." He wrote out a check and handed it to her. Margaret looked at it and felt the room spin. $50,000. She tried to hand it back, shaking her head. "I can't accept this. It's too much. I'm just a janitor." Thomas's eyes flashed with something fierce and protective. "You're not just anything, Mrs. Chen. You're a mother taking care of her daughter. You're a grandmother making sure your grandson has stability while his world falls apart. You're someone my father respected and cared about, and I was too blind to see what he saw." He stood up and walked around the desk, standing in front of her. "My father used to say that a company is only as good as how it treats its people when times are hard. I forgot that. I've been so focused on quarterly earnings and market share that I forgot we're dealing with human beings who have sick children and aging parents and struggles I never bothered to learn about. You've taught me something tonight, Mrs. Chen. Something I should have learned from watching my own father. Have you ever had someone see you, really see you, when you felt invisible? Have you been in a moment where kindness arrived when you least expected it? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your story." Margaret couldn't speak. The tears were flowing freely now, and she didn't try to stop them. Thomas continued, his own voice thick with emotion. "Take the check. Use it for Emily's care, for David's future, for whatever your family needs. And know that you'll never be punished here again for putting your daughter first." "That's a promise." Harrison quietly excused himself, clearly moved by what he'd witnessed. When the door closed, Margaret finally found her voice. "Why are you doing this? You don't even know me." Thomas smiled sadly. "Maybe that's exactly why I need to do it. Because I should know you. I've walked past you for 7 years, and I never once asked your name, your story, what you dreamed about or worried over. That ends tonight." He paused, looking out the window again at the city below. "My father would have known about Emily the first day she got sick. He would have been at the hospital, would have made sure your family had everything they needed. I want to be that kind of man. I want to build that kind of company. Will you help me?" The next morning, Margaret arrived at 6, her new start time, to find that word had spread through the building like wildfire. Other janitorial staff, security guards, even some of the early arriving office workers approached her with kind words, many sharing their own struggles they'd been hiding. A security guard named Ramon confessed he'd been caring for his father with dementia, constantly anxious about making it to work on time after difficult mornings. A young woman from accounting admitted she'd been taking night classes to finish her degree, but was terrified of being caught leaving early twice a week. Everyone had been suffering silently, maintaining the perfect employee facade while their real lives crumbled at the edges. Thomas called an all-staff meeting for that Friday. Margaret watched from the back of the conference room as he stood before hundreds of employees, looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. "I've been the CEO of this company for 7 years, he began, his voice steady despite his obvious discomfort. "In that time, we've grown exponentially. Our profits are up. Our market share has increased. By every business metric, we're succeeding." He paused, taking a breath. "But I've failed you. I've failed to see you as people with lives and families and struggles that don't stop when you walk through these doors." He told them about his mother's cancer, his father's grief, and how he'd misunderstood the lessons he'd been taught. "My father built this company on the belief that if we take care of our people, they'll take care of the business. Somewhere along the way, I reversed that equation. I expected you to take care of the business while I ignored your needs. That changes today." Thomas outlined a new policy framework: flexible scheduling for employees with family medical situations, a company fund to assist with catastrophic expenses, paid parental leave, mental health resources, and an open-door policy where anyone could bring concerns directly to leadership without fear of retribution. "And to start," he said, "I'm establishing the Patricia Westfield Memorial Fund," his mother's name, "to support employees and their families facing serious illness. Every dollar I contribute will be matched by the company, and any employee can apply for assistance, no questions asked. No judgment given." The room erupted in applause, but Margaret noticed something more important than the clapping. She saw people crying, saw shoulders relaxing, saw hope returning to faces that had been tight with stress for years. Thomas had done more than change a policy. He'd given people permission to be human again. After the meeting, Margaret was approached by a woman she'd seen but never spoken to, someone from the executive floor named Diana. "I wanted to thank you," Diana said quietly. "My son has autism. He's 12. Sometimes his school calls and I have to leave immediately, and I've been terrified every single time that it would cost me my job. What you did, what happened with you and Thomas, it saved more than just you. You saved all of us who've been hiding." Margaret hugged this stranger who was suddenly not a stranger at all, and felt the weight of their shared relief. If you've been with us this far, if this story has moved you or reminded you of your own journey, please consider subscribing to our channel for more stories that honor the strength and resilience of everyday people. Your support helps us continue sharing these moments that matter. That evening, Margaret invited Thomas to meet Emily. She'd asked her daughter first, of course, and Emily had agreed immediately, curious about the man who'd shown such unexpected kindness. Thomas arrived at their modest home with flowers and a children's book for David, looking more uncertain than he ever did in a boardroom. Emily answered the door, and Margaret's heart clenched, seeing her daughter's thin frame, the scarf covering her head where her hair had fallen out, the pallor of her skin. But Emily's smile was genuine and warm. "Mr. Westfield, please come in. Mom's told me everything." Thomas stepped inside and little David immediately toddled over, curious about the stranger. Thomas knelt down to the boy's level, his movements careful and gentle. "Hi there, David. Your grandmother talks about you all the time. She says you're very smart." David beamed and launched into an enthusiastic, barely comprehensible story about his toy trucks. Thomas listened with complete attention, responding seriously to the 3-year-old's commentary, and Margaret felt something crack open in her chest. This man, this supposedly cold CEO, was crouched on her daughter's living room floor, having an earnest conversation with a toddler about dump trucks and excavators. Emily caught Margaret's eye and smiled through tears. They sat together that evening, Margaret, Emily, Robert, Thomas, and little David, sharing a simple dinner of pasta and salad. Thomas told stories about his mother, his voice breaking occasionally but continuing on. He talked about how she'd loved gardening, how she'd made him promise to always remember that success without compassion was just another form of failure. Emily shared her own fears and hopes, her determination to fill David's memories with as much love as possible in whatever time remained. "I want him to remember that his mother fought," Emily said fiercely. "I want him to know that even when life is unfair and hard, you keep loving, keep trying, keep showing up." Thomas nodded, wiping his eyes without shame. "He'll remember. And when he's older, we'll make sure he knows the whole story, about his grandmother's courage, his mother's strength, and how love can transform everything it touches." Margaret looked around her daughter's table at this unlikely gathering and felt something shift in the universe. 3 months ago, she'd been invisible, alone in her struggle, counting down to the inevitable loss of both her job and her daughter. Now somehow she'd found an ally, a friend, and a reason to believe that kindness still existed in the world, even in the coldest of places. The weeks that followed brought changes both difficult and beautiful. Emily's condition continued to deteriorate despite everyone's hopes, but she was surrounded by love every step of the way. Thomas visited often, never empty-handed, always bringing books for David or groceries or simply his presence. He'd sit with Emily while Margaret rested, the two of them talking about everything and nothing, favorite movies, childhood memories, the strange comfort of honest conversation when pretense no longer matters. One evening, Emily confessed to him that she'd been worried about her mother. "When I'm gone, she'll be alone. Dad's been gone for years. I'm all she has. Thomas had taken Emily's thin hand in his. "She won't be alone, I promise you that." Margaret's new schedule at Westfield Industries transformed her life. Working 6 to 2 meant she could take Emily to afternoon appointments, could be home for dinner, could tuck David into bed while Emily rested. The other employees who'd been struggling stepped into their own new arrangements, the entire company culture shifting from rigid enforcement to compassionate flexibility. Productivity didn't suffer as Thomas had once feared it might. Instead, it soared. People worked harder when they weren't carrying the weight of hidden shame and constant anxiety. They stayed longer with the company, recommended it to friends, and spoke of Westfield Industries with pride rather than mere obligation. The Patricia Westfield Memorial Fund helped 43 families in its first 6 months. A maintenance worker's premature baby received specialized care. An accountant's husband got the addiction treatment he desperately needed. A receptionist's elderly mother moved into assisted living without bankrupting the family. Each story was different, but they all shared one common thread. Someone had finally seen them, had recognized their humanity, and had helped. Thomas changed too. He still arrived early and left late, but now he walked the floors differently, stopping to talk with employees, learning names and stories, asking about children and grandchildren and weekend plans. He was awkward at first, clearly out of practice with genuine human connection, but he tried. That's what mattered to Margaret. He tried. 5 months after that night in Thomas's office, Emily passed away on a quiet Sunday morning with Margaret holding one hand and Robert holding the other. Little David was with Robert's parents, spared from witnessing his mother's final moments. The funeral was held on a Wednesday, and Margaret was stunned to see Thomas arrive with nearly 50 Westfield employees, all of whom had asked for time off to attend and support her. They'd barely known Emily, but they knew Margaret, and they knew that she'd somehow changed everything for all of them. Diana from the executive floor organized a meal train that lasted for weeks. Ramon, the security guard, built David a bookshelf. Others sent cards, made donations to pancreatic cancer research in Emily's name, or simply showed up on Margaret's doorstep with quiet company and warm casseroles.